Welcome to all of us for this session, the first session this afternoon. We have the pleasure and we're greatly honored to welcome Denis Peschanski, who is a senior researcher in history at the CNRS, European Center for Sociology and Political Sciences. He's a well-known specialist in French history during the Second World War. So he produced research on Vichy, resistance, Holocaust studies, in historical methodology as well. So on archives, historians, experts in society. He also wrote on police and on French communism. So he's published nearly 30 books and 100 articles throughout his career. Is also a specialist in memory studies. He's driving a transdisciplinary technological platform named Matrice, and with a neuropsychologist, Francis Eustache, a large-scale program dealing with memory after the 2015 terrorist attacks against Paris. So Denis, if you...
So, first of all, I'd like to thank for your invitation, because in this amazing college with its amazing dream team, and also because I could hear a very interesting talk this morning. I wanted to tell you that I've published a few diaries. Angelo Tasca for understanding Vichy, Marcel Cachin for understanding communism, socialism, French socialism in the beginning of 19th century, and communism after, and also Goebbels' diary. And it's why it's for me very interesting, but it's not the subject of my talk, sorry. I talk about individual and collective memory. So it's impossible to fully understanding collective memory without considering the cerebral dynamics of memory. It's impossible to fully understanding cerebral dynamics without considering the impact of the social. More broadly, it's impossible to think separately about individual and collective memory. These postulates are at the origin of several programs that I have led or co-led for 15 years. I take two references, historical references in this presentation. World War II and November 13, 2015, terrorist attacks in Paris and on Paris, with a conclusion that I will give you straight away. Oh, yeah. With my colleague and friend, Francis Eustache, a neuropsychologist, we are arguing for new memory sciences based on 4 pillars: dialectic, transdisciplinarity, mathematical modelization, and complexity. Let's begin with the conceptual frameworks. Collective memory, it's simple because it's well known. We can define it as a selective representation of the past that participates in the identity construction of a society or a segment of the society. The second one, conditions of narrativization. Conditions for a given event to be retained by the collective memory. We could evocate the exodus of 1940 in France, or the bombings on Normandie in summer 1944. Since memory in history the conditions can be met at a given moment. And for example, it was impossible to have these bombings of Normandy in a collective memory in France, memory of World War II, no social utility, no sense, no collective memory. But it's changing now because we can give a sense to this event in collective memory. Third concept, memory regimes or memory patterns. It's a dominant representation of the past structured around one or more figures, positive or negative figures, and imposing itself as such for a certain duration. The last one, strong memory, weak memories. Strong memories, weak memories linked to memory regime because, for example, memory of the persecution of the Jews. Yes, it's a weak memory during the 50s in France, for example, but Anne Frank's diary was published in 1949 in France. And you know its immediate success. Now, let's go to individual to try to understand what our psychologists and neuroscientists tell us about individual memory. We can't ignore it. To explain the three moments of memory where the hippocampus plays a central role, encoding, storage, retrieval, and also to propose here a memory scheme elaborated by Béatrice Desgranges and Francis Eustache. And also perhaps to help us to understand autobiographical, biographical memory. Autobiographical memory is a mix of episodic memory, which is responsible for the encoding, storage, and retrieval of personally experienced events, and also semantic memory, which made up of general knowledge about oneself and memory of general events from various encoding sources without access to their learning context. But now, let's take some concrete examples of illustration of this concept. These tools tell us how complex it is to bring together individual and collective memory, but also the obvious necessity for anyone working on oral and or written testimonies. I will take two different corpora. One on the memory of the World War II, and the other on the memory of the terrorist Islamist attacks of November 13, 2015 in Paris and Saint-Denis. First, memories of a traumatic event is as a study of the vocabulary of deportees of repression during World War II, the resistance fighters. It's an example where history, psychology, linguistics, and statistics are combined. These testimonies here are analyzed within the framework of the matrice équipement d'excellence. You told about it some words. So what is the reference corpus? It's a corpus of 240 audio testimonies produced by the Fondation pour la mémoire de la déportation. And we used the integrated TXM software to analyze the vocabulary used. The article is still to be submitted, but I give you some conclusion. First, what method did we use? Within TXM, we have favored here what we name correspondence factorial or factor analysis. it's a method it detects, which can detect associations and opposition between people using words. And here we cross deportees and the main 300 nouns and verbs they used in their testimonies. You see here the first axe and the second one, but the first axe here is very interesting. You know, is the most important. This method can class the hierarchy with a hierarchy of axes or factors, given some information about this cloud. Because when you cross 240 people with 300 words, you have a cloud of 239 dimensions. So it's impossible to analyze it if you don't use this method. And you have the first factors which give you the most important information of the cloud, and so on. And here was very interesting. Look at the arrows here. Here. You see that? It's a mix here of testimonies of men and women. And those with arrows are the women. So the conclusion is clear. The main variable by far is gender, is the opposition between women and men between their interviews. Wanting to know more, I isolated the testimonies of the women. The first factor contributed little, but the essential is not here, it's here. You see here the different first factors of this cloud. And what you see that the factors are very close. So the cloud is very homogeneous. In other words, the first conclusion to be drawn is that not only women differ from men in the words they use, but overall, they hardly distinguish between them. It's very homogeneous. It's what? And this is essential because we have women with very different levels of education and income, with up of 15 years different between the youngest and the oldest, rural and urban women, and perhaps above all, politically different. We have communists, socialists, coalists, and so on. But it is the consistency of the cloud that stands out first. On the same corpus, here's another method proposed by the researcher of Nice with their EHESS software. It's another team in our project. And here you have the first result. It's the correlates. The principle is similar to what we have just seen, with a big difference. We forget the partition between authors, in authors. We consider the corpus as unique, as a single text, and we base ourselves on the proximity in the use of the words, whatever their authors, which makes it possible to locate word clusters. Here you have the distribution of nouns and verbs used by the men. We can clearly Clearly, yes, clearly. C, 4 clusters of words used by men, life before an involvement in the resistance, the convoy, life in the camp, hunger. With women's case, 3 words clusters summarize their vocabulary. Time of resistance, with a crucial place given to family, time of internment and convoy, and time of life in concentration camps or German jails. Of course, there is much more to say, but we have no time. The second example, I would like to take is even more relevant to the subject that brings us together. It concerns 20 testimonies written by the survivors of the Shoah and published by the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah, a partner of the Équipement d'Excellence Matrice. Damon Mayafre and his colleagues have favored, again, Hyperbase and Iramutect. The first article was published in 2014. In it, they show a very clear distribution of vocabulary into 5 classes: words of everyday life in the camps, words of the body, words of the kinship, general words about the war and deportation, and words of the camp. And finally, Damon Mayafre have proposed an interpretative hypothesis of vocabulary distribution. Here, you have the different types of vocabulary, and the two relation with the event, you know, and when you cross this, two approaches, you can propose a new hypothesis. You can see that the distribution with the Iramutect, and here an opposition between the books, the diaries which were written just after the war, and those who were written in 2010. Sorry for the words in French, but it was in the publication. So it's very interesting because they conclude that life stories from a distance of n years seem to have to respond to the double imperative of bringing the event to life and making it intelligible. Here we are at the heart of both the narrative identity of the witness and of historical narration. This double imperative requires 2 complementary lexicons. And this today has shown that the respective share of this lexicon varied over the years in order to describe an original historicization of the Shoah. This historicization is thus to be found at the very heart of the life story. Initially, sensory and egocentric, here. In 1940, 40s and 1950s, the testimonies become disembodied over time to become more rational and collective. The intelligibility of the event goes through a rationalization, and the sensitive memory gives way to a re-elaborated memory. And we can see back this interpretative hypothesis of vocabulary distribution. But for a few years now, for a few years now, we have been embarking on another program. which covers the years 2016 and 2028. Just after the attacks of November 13, 2015 in Paris and Saint-Denis, we decided to launch a very large program, not on the event, but on the memory of the event. I'm piloting it with Francis Eustache, neuropsychologist. I stress on that because of this originality. Here you have an image of the transdisciplinarity. All these disciplines are convocated to understand, to try to understanding memory of this traumatic event. There are 10 studies that now make up the Programme 13 Novembre. You have Études 1000, remember, it's a study in biomedical research. ESPA 13 Novembre is a public health studies with epidemiologists of Santé Publique France. Credoc explained that, and also the school world in the face of the 2015 attacks, and so on, fiction and non-fiction and legal studies. And we will begin next month 2 new tracks. First, Études 1000. It's necessary to recall that an American psychologist, William Hearst, conducted a vast survey on the memory of 9/11 by sending out a written questionnaire 4 times in 10 years. The results are really fascinating, even if this initial aim was not to find the same people. And let's look at the similarities, because we worked with him and we work with him now, but also the differences. We have decided to organize 4 campaigns of interviews in 10 years, but a maxima with the same people. So we have interviewed people in 2016, in 2018, and we're finished, almost finished, in the third phase in 2021, and after we have the last one in 2026. So, secondly, we set ourselves the goal of obtaining the testimonies of 1,000 people, sorry, from the closest to the furthest away from the event, direct or indirect witnesses of the attacks. Here you are from Circle 1, people directly exposed to the attacks, to Circle 4 with inhabitants of 3 towns, you know, perhaps Caen, Metz, and Montpellier, far from Paris. Thanks to Institut National de l'Audiovisuel and ECPAD, the French Army's audiovisual establishment, all the recordings are audiovisual. It was not the case with the Bill project, in the Bill project. And remember, only psychological questionnaires written. Here we have recordings and audiovisual recordings. So the same questions are asked all 4 times in 10 years, and will be asking next phase. The same questions. It's why we can compare. Let's take stock. Now that we are almost at the end of phase 3. It is more than 5 years after the first phase and 6 years after the event. So in phase 1, you see we have 934 participants, of which almost no. So you can conclude not far to it une mille to the 1,000 participants, of which almost 40% were from Circle 1. It is the exposed people. That is 1,431 audiovisual hours. In phase 2, with 839 participants, volunteers, we had more than 100 new participants, still many from Circle 1, and 720 volunteers from phase 1 returned. That is 77%. And the epidemiologists tell us that this is a rather exceptional result. And we are therefore talking about an attrition rate of 23%. For phase 3, in fall 2021, the challenge was also more complicated because it was more than 5 years after phase 1. To date, we still have 10 or 15 interviews to do. There are 968 interviews, more than in phase 2 and even more than in phase 1. We wanted to record new ones with the idea of measuring by comparison the possible impact in the impact of the lack of knowledge of the protocol on the proposed narrative. But what is striking here again is a rate of return, and therefore, complementarily, the attrition rate. Nearly 80% of participants of phase 2 returned. If we consider the 3 phases, we have 570 people for whom we have testimonies in 16, 18, and 21. You can imagine the interest of such corpus for those who wish to analyze the evolution of individual memories over time. Let us remember that, of course, the same questions are asked at each phase. At the audiovisual interview, the transcription process is very long. For the emotional and even based questionnaires, the results are already in a database. But for the non-directive interview, here you see, remember the first semi-directive open-ended interviews about November 13. So for the non-directive or semi-directive interview, the first and longest part, there is first of a speech-to-text transcription by computer, and then we have to correct it. To give you an idea, the corrective transcripts from phase 1 represent a corpus of 800 million bytes, the equivalent of a print book of 400,000 pages, just for phase 1. We have to work. And also with us have a patrimonialization of memories of the terrorist attacks of November 13, 2015. It also calls for a lot of work on the data. Let's take 3 examples. For the book 13 Novembre, des témoignages un récit, in 2020, is a reconstruction of the story based on the verbatim accounts of the testimonies of Circle 1 from phase 1. But you have 320 people who have given their testimonies. So from an epistemological point of view, it's very interesting because by crossing the sources over these 3 hours, because even the duration of this event is 3 hours, that we are recounting here, we move from the truth of the witness to the truth of the event. The second book was written by Christian Chevandier, who were professor at Université du Havre, Myriam, and before, and also at the same time, member of the Centre d'Histoire Sociale, Judith, 2 images. So, however, it's a book about the police officers of November 13. The approach is different, but very interesting, because it's an important part of the book is a sociological and even more anthropological approach, which is quite fascinating. What can we do with the textual data? We can, for example, mobilize textometric tools. We are just starting. We start with the 80 testimonies collected in MES in 2016. That was the first phase, but circle 4, if you remember both. So by crossing the words and the participants, by crossing the words and the participants, we see that 2 variables stand out spectacularly: age and gender again. Age, you see the number 4 and number 1 on the right, number 4 on the left is the first factor, preeminent factor. And second one here, you see M for men, F for women, and you see the opposition between the 2 lexicons. The corresponding factor analysis is the opposition between the youngest and the oldest. It's interesting for linguists, for example, but it's not a surprise for me. But also between women and men. This is all the more exciting as it was not clear that textometry would bring to bear on very indirect witnesses. I have had added an example of a correspondence table connected to the word enfant to show how the analysis can be deepened. But how to approach the collective memory? That's the objective of the CREDOC surveys. The CREDOC Living Conditions and Aspiration Survey, it's a longitudinal study that has been going on since 1978, every 6 months. It takes place twice a year, and it's a representative sample of the French population is interviewed on a large scale of topics, opinion, values, way of life, and so on. So the representativeness of the sample is absolutely guaranteed. So as indicated here, we have carried out several surveys with CREDOC since the start of the program. The idea is simple. In Étude 1000, our sample of volunteers is obviously not representative of the French population. If we want to understand the collective memory of the terror attacks of November 13, nothing beats a survey. We asked 11 questions at the time of each phase in June 16, 18, and 21. In January, we also asked a few questions to complete the picture on 3 occasions, 17, 19, and 21. So let's look at some of the main conclusions. First, we noted what I named a first memory condensation. To the question, which terrorist attacks have had the greatest impact on you since 2000? The answer shows that increasingly the attacks of November 13 are the primary reference in relation to 9/11, the attacks of January 2015 in France, Charlie Hebdo, Hypercacher, police officers, and the terrorist attack of July 14, 2016 in Nice. Another question allows us to note a second memory condensation. The question was not put in January, it's why we have only 3 references. When we ask the questions of the places of November 13, location of November 13, a spectacular condensation takes place on imprecise Paris, and above all, on a very precise location, Bataclan. 2 additional remarks are in order. First, the number of non-responses has increased significantly over the last few years, particularly in the lower classes. And second, we have not yet measured the impact of the trial that began in September 2021, trial of November 30, a historic trial that is due to end next June. And the question is, are we moving toward the construction of a great shared narrative that will influence all individual memories and modify the collective memory of November 13? This is a crucial question, especially as for the survivors and bereaved parents of the Stade de France or the terraces. For the moment, it's a double punishment. They have suffered terribly, and they have the feeling that they have been forgotten by society. And now let's move on the biomedical study, which name is Remember. I will be very quick, sorry. The design is simple. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is primarily a memory illness and the characteristic pathology that follows a traumatic event. There are various defining criteria of PTSD. You see them here. You can read them. The most important of which are the intrusive images that are constantly recalled and the avoidance. It is the flight from anything that might bring back these very painful intrusive images, restaurants, theaters, public transport, and so on. Let us recall the principle of trauma. It is the presence of the past that imposes itself in the present as the present. The characteristic of intrusive images is that they are decontextualized flashes. It is therefore easy to understand that all therapies aim to send the traumatic event back to where it belongs, in the past. It remains painful, but it is in the past and therefore no longer traumatic. Almost 200 volunteers are participating in our biomedical protocol. 120 have been exposed, and just over 70 constitute what we name in biology the control group. They go to Caen, where they have 2 days of examinations, including, for example, 90 minutes of MRI. You imagine for victims, we were in Bataclan in the terraces, but look at the specificity of this group, sorry. There are 3 sets, not 2 sets. Usually, when you propose the biomedical research, you have 2 groups, a pathological one and a control group. Here we have 3 groups. That's why it's very interesting, because the exposed will still, you have the unexposed here, control group. But you have those who still had PTSD when they arrived in Caen. For the first phase, it's in between fall 16 and the end of spring 17. But you have also the exposed who no longer had PTSD, the resilient, or who had never had PTSD, the resistant. Here, PTSD minus, PTSD plus. Here I speak of PTSD minus. So let's summarize. 2 people are in the middle of the Bataclan pit. They stay perhaps 20 minutes. They don't know themselves. They don't know together. You know, before coming out, they stay here 20 minutes, same time. 1 year later, when they came in Caen, one has a PTSD plus, the other one has not. Why? This is another crucial question that is undoubtedly partly answered by biology, but much more by the humanities and social sciences. We thus loop back to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. For the time being, let's stick to what we observe in the hippocampus, the brain structure that are so crucial to memory, using a protocol that he learned here at Cambridge from Mike Anderson, the well-known neuroscientist. The young researcher Pierre Gagnepin initiated in Remember reflection on the connections between the connective control tower, the prefrontal cortex, and the cognitive functions, subcortical, in this case, the hippocampus, but we have also amygdala for the zone of the, je cherche le bon en français maintenant. No, it's not a problem. I remember, sorry. The results were spectacular and led to an article published in Science in February 2020. Yes, amygdala is the area of emotions. And it's very interesting to compare amygdala and hippocampus. So the experimental reconstruction of intrusive but non-traumatic images made it possible to distinguish 3 brains shown here. On the left, the normal, the non-pathological group shows a connection network that controls the hippocampus. This is in stark contrast to the PTSD brain, PTSD plus brain. Here, on your right. It's as if the prefrontal cortex no longer has any control over the hippocampus. In the middle, another case, very interesting one. The resilient of resistance, so PTSD minus, so exposed but without PTSD at this moment, show an extremely dense network of connections. The second example I will take still in the study of the hippocampus is an article published in the Neurobiology of Stress in 2021. Charlotte Postel and Pierre Gagnepin initiates a very fine division of the hippocampal zones. I will retain only one thing for today, the differential in hippocampal volumetry between unexposed and PTSD minus on the one hand, and PTSD plus on the other. You see here the difference. You have here the exposed PTSD plus. The contrast is significant, but is it the initial weakness of the hippocampus that is a favorable ground for PTSD, or is it the PTSD that causes hippocampal atrophy? This is a major question, the answer to which will be given in a forthcoming article, and for which we already had some premonitions. Why? Because Charlotte Postel wrote her article based on phase 1 of Remember. But as most of the volunteers came back in phase 2, 2 years after, in 1819, we can now, who still has PTSD and who is resilient when they were PTSD plus in phase 1, about 33% of cases. And what do we find? That the resilient ones have all largely recovered their initial hippocampal volumetry thanks to brain plasticity. To conclude, I will simply mention 2 other aspects of our program. First, the literature of fiction and no fiction led by Catherine Brin's team at Paris 3, and legal studies centered on the victims, right, by the team of lawyers at Rennes, led by Philippe Pierre, and propose here to a book, Victimes du terrorisme, and a lot of paper published about victim. It's also a transdisciplinary approach, so I'm a historian a little bit. Marc Répond is a philosopher, another one economist, and you have a dialogue between Cyrus Vance Jr. and François Molins. So it's interesting, it's online in the Internet Journal of Criminology. So these programs were led by CNRS, INSERM, and EHESS Université, were 31 partners and a lot of supports. And here you have a part of our dream team. So in proposing you this broad and brief, very brief, I'm not sure, overview of our ongoing work and reflections, I wanted to put into perspective the memory issues that are at the heart of your work. I hope that this contribution will be useful to your reflection. Thank you.